Welcome to the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm Jules van Binsbergen, director of the Institute and a finance professor at the Wharton School.
And I'm Jonathan Berk, a finance professor at the Graduate School of Business at Stanford University. This is the All Else Equal podcast. Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to talk about the value of education. Let me start this episode out by saying that every now and again, you read a book that kind of shakes you at your core or one of your beliefs. And that experience happened to me a few months ago when I read a book by our guest today, Bryan Caplan, who we'll introduce later. The title of the book is The Case Against Education. And in the book, Bryan argues that we are vastly overeducated. And of course, as an educator myself, I approached this book with a great level of skepticism. But by the time I finished reading it, it was very hard to argue against the evidence. Well, left me wondering what I've been doing for the last 30 years. So we thought we'd do an episode on this. And let me start out by saying, the basic thesis in the book is that there are great returns to being educated, but most of those returns come from signaling.
So let's first distinguish what I think, Jonathan, are potentially three different ways in which education could have an effect on the job market or on job market outcomes, I guess. And later we'll have to talk about whether the economic outcomes is really the only thing we should be talking about. But let's start there. I think that there are roughly three things we can talk about. The first one is, by getting education, you build human capital, meaning you develop skills. Those skills would not have been developed had you not taken the education. And by taking the education, you therefore become a more valuable person to society. That's hypothesis one. Hypothesis two is people that do high levels of education, or particularly that go to, say, top institutions, it's purely selection effect, which means that the reason why those people do well is not because they learned a lot of skills. It is just that the best people end up being in these very good places. And then the third one, which is the one that you mentioned, and which is I think we should spend a little bit of time explaining to our listeners, is what we call signaling. So by doing education, you signal something about yourself.
Yeah, so the crucial thing is there's an asymmetry of information. You know something about yourself, but your employer doesn't. And you're going to signal that by doing something that's costly to you, and that somebody who didn't have your ability or didn't have your skill, it'd be too costly for them to do it. That's the crucial insight in the signaling model. And the idea is that most of the returns for education, most of the high salaries are signaling. Employers don't know who the good employees are. The fact that they, A, got into the top universities, but more importantly, survived the top universities, doing boring stuff that they were uninterested in, shows a commitment that employers want, and that people who don't have that staying power, who don't have that ability, are unable to stay in university. And as a result, employers value that and they pay a lot for it.
So another way of saying that is, good people need to jump through a whole lot of hoops. And the ones that are good can jump through the hoops, whereas people that aren't that good cannot jump through the hoops. But let's be clear, whatever hoops you let people jump through isn't that important. It's not like there's an intrinsic value to the particular hoops that we make people jump through. And that is, I think, what you and I have been operating under the assumption of, which is that the hoops you jump through, the things that you do are actually in themselves useful things because you're learning skills and you build your human capital by doing it. What Bryan essentially says is it doesn't really matter what hoops you make people jump through as long as you let them signal their resilience and their conscientiousness by putting up a bunch of hoops.
Yeah, so I think the best way to see this is to contrast the human capital model from the other two models, which is ability. So just to differentiate between signaling and ability. With ability, there's no asymmetry of information. Good people go to college for whatever reason they go to college, and they earn higher salaries. Signaling, the crucial difference is there's an asymmetry of information. And so that's what separates the ability story from the signaling story. But both of those stories have the feature that it's in the individual's interest to go to university. They get a big pay increase. In both cases, they reveal their ability to do the job. But it's no benefit to society whatsoever. Whereas the human capital story it's in everybody's individual interest to learn the skills to do the job, but it's also in society's interests because people learn the skills and society's better off because people do better jobs. And so the crucial difference between these two stories is in the one case, you're just doing it for yourself, but there's no benefit to society. In the other case, you're doing it for both yourself and society. And since most democracies, most societies spend a lot of money subsidizing education, if the human capital story is wrong, that's a waste of money. In fact, it makes it even worse because when you subsidize, then you have to jump through more hoops to signal. And so there's the signaling, the actual act of signaling is a waste of effort. It's just a way of differentiating yourself. And the more people who get in and differentiate themselves, the harder it is to differentiate yourself and the more effort you have to spend, but all that effort is wasted.
Yeah, so indeed, if we're dealing with simply an arms race, the last thing you want to do is subsidize an arms race. That seems like an entire waste of resources. Now, we do need to put a number of qualifications in, right, Jonathan? So first of all, we're just saying this broad word education, and we just, in one shot, we cover everything that you could possibly learn. I do think that an increasing fraction of the American population today is starting to wonder whether a college education is actually worth it for them. And so we need to somehow square that with this, right? I mean, clearly, the signaling story would still mean that most people want to jump through the hoops.
Well, Jules, I would say that that's a very small minority. Today, most people still compete very strongly to get into the best schools. So I would say the signaling story is really strong. I will say that what shook me to the core in the book was the evidence he provided. And in this case, what really shook me was the observation that people do not use the skills on the job that they're taught in university. I should say that he doesn't feel as if high school education or tertiary or primary education is bad. It's really the book's about university education. And it's true. People don't use the skills they learn in college on the job. Almost all of them do not do that. So why do we provide people with those skills?
Well, so I would say a couple things to that, right? So I'm less shaken to the core than you are by the book, I think, because let's just push back a little bit against the book and think about the arguments against it, right? So the first one is, suppose you and I would say we have a big research question here. We have a research question about whether or not education actually builds human capital, yes or no. And then how would we set up an experiment to test whether or not societies that do the college model like we have it today, whether they're in the long run more successful than societies that don't have the college model that we have today. And you know, I think that in the past, we have had societal structures, say the guilds, where people would not go to college, but they would just do on-the-job training. They would just learn the relevant skills by a particular master that would teach them how to do their job well. The thing is that we don't really have a clean experiment right now where we do a randomized controlled trial. We're not really observing US society, an alternative version of it that doesn't have the college system in place that we have right now, that has only on-the-job training, and then see how such a society would do. Would it be equally innovative? Would it be equally productive? I mean, clearly, if you compare the US with most other countries in the world in terms of economic growth, productivity growth, number of patents that are filed, the country is doing something right. And so a lot of people have pointed at university as being one of the major driving forces of all of that. And so just to say that the college education is not really providing that much value, that doesn't mean that there are not a bunch of observations that could be consistent with the theory that Bryan has. But I'm not sure that the book provides definitive proof because we don't see that counterfactual world without a college education.
So Jules, before I read the book, I would have completely agreed with you. The problem I had when I read the book is he does amass a bunch of data that seems to suggest that what we're doing right now is wasting effort. So I agree, there's no counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened had we had a society where there was on-the-job training. His major point, though, is why is it better to educate off the job? And so I would have argued, well, come on, you have to learn how to think. The problem is there's very little evidence that students actually do learn how to think universities. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence that the signaling aspect is very important. I think the strongest piece of evidence he points out is what he calls a sheepskin effect, which is people who graduate earn a substantial premium over people who are one semester away from graduation. If you thought this was human capital, then if you're one semester away from graduation, well, you should have 80% of the skills. So you should make 80%, but you don't. So, that fact is a pretty damning fact that this is actually mostly signaling, not human capital.
I have two responses to that. So the first response is, if somebody's really close to graduating and then doesn't, that may just be telling you something about that person that indeed would warrant a salary that is that much lower, even if they built up the human capital. That's one. Second, even if most of us say don't remember very much or don't use the things that we learned in school on the job directly, does that really mean that going through those thought processes and debating those things and learning those things didn't still create synaptic connections in your brain and taught you how to think about certain things? Now, we both agree that we wish that people would be better able to critically think that they are. But again, I want to throw the counterfactual at you. Do we really know what the world would look like if we wouldn't even have done that level of education? Maybe it would have been substantially worse. I'm not sure that we have that evidence available right now. Now, I do think that we should strive as much as we can to try to teach people to critically think. And both you and I, in the way that we teach, we try to do everything we can to get that done, no matter how hard that is.
Jules, yes. And again, before reading that book, I would have been strongly arguing your case. I'll tell you what he does point to is the psychological evidence that you don't actually see any evidence of what you say. It's this grand experiment where they took a bunch of people, they taught them a fact, and then after the fact, they gave them a problem very closely related to the problem they'd taught them. And only about half of them recognized that it was the same problem again. And then they did what I consider to be the really depressing thing, which is they gave them the exact same problem, but in a completely different context. And almost nobody could transfer the knowledge.
So let me give you one last argument, and then I think we should introduce our guest, right? So the main evidence seems to focus on what I think is economic effects and whether and how much money you make on the job, right? But obviously, in the way that we have society organized, there are other things that are important too, right? We would like people to be participating citizens in the democratic process. We want them to be able to listen to, I would say, an increasingly varied supply of sources, information that can come from AI or from wherever. And if people are not able to process that information, I think it's very difficult to have a well-functioning democratic society. So just even if the economic effects wouldn't be there, wouldn't you say that from a citizen point of view, there's at least something for us to think about and strive for, no matter how difficult that is?
I agree completely. I just don't think we do a very good job of that at all. I think, look at the current situation.
We're on the same page there, but maybe that just means we should try harder.
Our guest today is Bryan Caplan, who is a professor of economics at George Mason University, a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center, and an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute. The book we're going to talk about today that he wrote is called The Case Against Education: Why the Education System is a Waste of Time and Money.
Well, Bryan, thank you so much for being with us. It's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Pleasure to be here.
So we're going to talk about education, and we're going to talk about what really is going on in education, which you've written a very interesting book about. And the book's title, I think, leaves no doubt about what the main case is that you're trying to make, because the title of the book is The Case Against Education. What do you think is the most convincing evidence supporting the view that you have that most of education is actually not the building up of human capital, which I think a lot of economists and a lot of people think is what education is all about, but rather that it is about signaling?
Ultimately, it comes down to looking at the curriculum, what's actually being taught in school. You will see that a large share of the typical student's day just gets spent on stuff where it's very hard to imagine that they would ever use it on a job, unless, of course, the job is teaching the very subject that they are studying. Like, just going through, why do we do foreign languages in the United States? especially given that almost no one learns them to any functional degree. Why do we study history or poetry? So on. So that is where I would always start. And then really the main reply to that is just, oh, well, it might be super useful, even though it isn't directly relevant because you learned how to learn or you learn how to think. And that's where you can go into a big literature in psychology that has investigated that and just found that that is basically just wishful thinking.
So, Bryan, is a liberal arts education just a failed experiment then?
It's interesting that you should say that. I would say that there's a certain kind of person where it works great. There's a certain kind of person who already has their career taken care of through family or whatever, and they're just fascinated by the great books. And they go to the University of Chicago where there's some other people who feel the same way, and they just have an incredible 4-year intellectual adventure. And if you're someone like that, like, I love people like that. They're so much fun. I'm probably like that in a lot of ways, but that's just not what's going on in the vast majority of liberal arts degrees. Vast majority are people who they're doing it because they just can't think of something better to do. They don't really have much curiosity about it. And what they are hoping to do at the end is not just to take over the family business or something that's already been handed out to them. They're hoping to go and make their way in the world. And that's where liberal arts don't do very well. Again, to be fair, many people read my book and think that it's an attack on the liberal arts. Actually, liberal arts have been in decline for a long time in terms of the share of students that are doing them. And the most archetypal kind of thing that students are doing in college now are what I call the fake vocational degrees. These are degrees in things like communications or psychology, where on the surface, it sounds like you're getting prepared for a job. But the harsh reality is that there are way more people that are graduating every year with those degrees than there are jobs in the entire field. So there's way more communications majors coming out than there are jobs in like all of television, radio, internet, print. So it isn't really vocational because it's just basically selling fantasies.
So, Bryan, in terms of the experiment that we want to run, right now we have a system in place. We test what is retained at the end, and we conclude that it doesn't work very well. But in some sense, the real experiment we want to be running is, suppose we hadn't educated any of these people beyond what you argue for, which is basic reading and math skills, and then see whether their careers would have been the same. Are you confident, if I look at myself, for example, and I think, suppose I had just stopped my education after age 15, would I be able to do the same job that I do now? The answer is definitely no.
You're in the education industry, so there's something funny about the comparison, right?
You know, sure, while I worked in banking, I'm pretty sure that I would not have been able to do my job in banking if I had stopped at 15. You can say that's an outlier. That's not a representative sample. So are you willing, based on the book that you've written, to take the stance that if we would just stop educating after age 15, people would still pretty much have the same career outcomes as we're currently seeing? Or would you be hesitant to make that claim?
Well, so what I claim is if we took that 15-year-old you and we put you straight into a banking apprenticeship, then I think you could have been just as well and better in the same amount of time. And in, for example, Germany, they really do have banking apprenticeships. So you will take someone in that position and start teaching them how to do it. And really, this is my story for how it is that anything gets done in the world, is that we graduate students who still don't know how to do much of anything, and then they learn by doing. This is a slogan I actually came up with after I finished writing the book, so it doesn't make it in the book. But the slogan is, we like to think about education as job training, but it's really more like a passport to the real training, which happens on the job. So if you're 15 and then you just don't do anything else that tests your limits, you don't get any further training, then sure, you're right, you're not competent. I say the alternative is putting people into jobs where they learn by doing rather than going and having them kill more time in school. You can already see examples like this in things like how medical school works in the UK versus the US. So in the UK, you go straight from high school to medical school with no undergraduate in between.
Same in the Netherlands. But this does raise another point, which is this. We essentially, the system that you want, we had it. It was called the guild system. The guild system meant that people wouldn't go through all of this. And yet, that system, which you argue for is the best system to have, we somehow converged away from it. So what do you think was the reason why we got off track, if you will?
It's a good question. I mean, partly, of course, during the guild system, it would have been quite rare to be in a guild because most people were farmers. So I don't think there was a guild for farmers. It was really just for specialized trades rather than for the entire population. And also, I would say that you shouldn't give credit to guilds for being the exclusive trainers of people. There were all these other jobs that weren't part of the guild system where people were learning by doing too. So that's how you learn to be a farmer. It isn't by farmer school or going into the farmers guild. It's by getting a job on a farm and learning how it's done. In terms of how it was that we changed, this is one where, I think the evidence is quite a bit weaker, but it does seem like you had the more advanced economies got richer, and then actually had the surplus resources to go and take kids out of the labor force and put them into school for many years. A lot of people, including economists, want to reverse the causation and say that putting kids in school caused the Industrial Revolution. It's like, or maybe the wealth of the Industrial Revolution made it possible to put kids into school for all those years. Is that another story you might consider? And then what you see around the world is there's a lot of what you could call the cargo cult. Well, all the rich countries put their kids in these classrooms and make them spend an enormous number of years in school. If we want to be like the successful societies, we better do that too. An example that really stuck with me recently. So recently I got to be in Qatar for a while, and I was there, hanging out at the universities built with the immense oil revenue, or I guess natural gas revenue of Qatar. And you're there and it's like, look, the wealth of Qatar did not come from these universities. It's the other way around. The universities came from the wealth of Qatar, of course. So I think that would be my preferred story. It just seems like there's a lot of contingency such that it gets started off at the ground floor and then people want to imitate it and then it spreads. And so I know that's not that satisfying, but ultimately I'd say that's at least less unsatisfying than they happen to stumble across this incredible formula. And if you do it differently, then your society can't function, which just seems silly.
So, Bryan, in your answer to Jules, I was a little bit surprised because I didn't think the major takeaway from the book is that we should stop educating at 15. I thought the major takeaway is we should stop educating most people at 15. Right? I mean, if you think of an engineer has to understand how to solve a differential equation.
Yes.
It's going to take a couple of years, maybe 4 years of college to learn how to solve a differential equation.
Yes, so absolutely. And I'm not someone saying zero people should be doing it. I mean, obviously, just like for the liberal arts, there is a certain small, rare, but wonderful kind of person that just loves this stuff, and more power to them. And then similarly, there are areas where there's a lot of technical knowledge and we get it in through a lot of repetition. I will say that partly for the process of writing the book, but also just from talking about it to people in a lot of other fields that are further from my areas of direct experience, that even people in fields that I would naturally tend to think of as very vocational, they will go and say it's not as vocational as you think. My dad is a PhD in engineering, and he has told me many times, most of what he learned in school, he never learned on the job. And then well, how does he know how to do this stuff? By doing. Now, you may say, well, you need to have some of the book learning even to learn by doing. There's something to that. But still, it is striking how even the most vocational fields, there is this big area of waste. So law school, again, seems like they're just training you for a vocation, right? And yet, what they teach in the first year of law school? It's like the law of 12th century England. My wife is a financial attorney. When she did financial law in the 90s, they taught her the law of the 60s and 70s. And when she actually had a job, basically, the first thing is, look, don't use the stuff you learned in school. It would be a malpractice to use what you learned in school because the law has changed. And as to why the school didn't feel the need to be up to date, it's an interesting question. It's pretty standard among professors that, I'll update my notes every 5-10 years. That's good enough, right?
Yeah, I mean, those schools are actually an embarrassment.
And yet it seems vocational, doesn't it? If you're not a lawyer, it seems like they're going there to get training for a craft.
Well, so, they don't train you to pass the bar exam. Law students have to take a separate course to pass the bar exam. It seems ludicrous. At the same time, I think they would say, we're training you how to think as a lawyer.
Right. But without any evidence-based studies showing that actually has been accomplished. So my guess is there's a little bit of that, but much more is just what I call signaling. It's you jump through a lot of hoops so that people say, look, it's worth taking a bet on this person. This person seems employable because they successfully got through all these hoops. And by the way, Jules, one other thing that I'd say is, while I agree that you couldn't do your job if you would quit school at 15, I'd also say, tell me if I'm wrong, you couldn't do your job if you only knew everything that you learned in school. Really, to do the job of a real research professor, you've got to learn about 10 times as much as they teach you in school through self-teaching. And that is what differentiates an actual researcher from someone that just completed the coursework successfully.
No, and I've told Jonathan this many times. I learned the most from finance from my fellow professors also at Stanford. I mean, that was an incredibly educational, and co-teaching with them was actually a moment that I learned a lot from. But that is still very different than saying, suppose I'd stopped at 15 and then I would just at age 27 start co-teaching with them. Would I be able to reach the same level, or what is it a gradual build-up? I mean, a lot of the evidence that you quote and the empirical evidence that we have is just that everything that we are doing may not be as successful as we want it to be, but we are not observing the counterfactual where we have a society. And I don't think there exists a society right now where we'd have the system that you propose that is equally economically successful and equally successful scientifically as the system that we have now. If we had that piece of evidence to complement your book, that would make your book even more convincing. But obviously, it's impossible to run that experiment. That's really what we want to know.
Well, here's what I say that we are able to do. We're able to go and compare, for example, bankers today versus bankers in 1945 in terms of their formal credentials. And we will see that bankers in 1945 were way worse in terms of formal credentials. But in terms of their actual ability to go and make successful loans and figure out what's going to be a good bet, I at least say it's far from clear that they were worse at what they were doing. This credential inflation, we can see it throughout almost the entire economy. That throughout almost the entire economy, people now have a lot more formal years of schooling. But in terms of being better at their jobs, it is just not clear there's been much improvement at all in at least most occupations.
So, Bryan, I want to come back to something that you said earlier, which was that you argued that a whole body of psychology literature essentially shows that teaching people how to think doesn't really work. If I look at the students that I teach, it seems to me that the standard attitude that most people have with respect to intellectual questions is one of laziness. I think intellectual laziness is everywhere, and people just take a whole bunch of things for granted. They haven't been trained to critically evaluate statements that are being put in front of them. It's much easier to go along with them. It's much easier to just be in the group and say what the group is saying without critical evaluation. But particularly when in the classroom you set up a debating type of culture and you intentionally incentivize and teach people to critically evaluate all statements, by the end of the semester, you do get a much more of a critically evaluating group of students. Wouldn't you call that part of the value of education, that you train people to leave behind the intellectual laziness, just like you teach them about workout schedules where your muscles need to be trained, that you get them into a certain attitude? Or would you not call that the value of education?
Well, I start out by saying that sounds great, but it's so rare, and yet education is so lucrative that can't be the reason. So if only one professor in 30 does what you do, and I'd say that's probably pretty fair, and yet the average student is getting a large payoff in the labor market, it can't be the labor market is rewarding them because of those things that you did with them, because most people don't get that experience, definitely not in that kind of a dosage. If you were to go and really dig into, all right, but have you given them something special? First of all, the very fact that we're talking suggests you are something special. And so it's like, all right, so like, it's fine. There can be exceptions in the world. What I would still wonder about, so two things, and these are two things, both of which have been studied empirically. So one is, do your students that have in fact improved a lot, if you take them outside of the classroom and you don't go and say, hey, use what Jules taught you now, do they still do it? And the experiments that we've done on that say basically no. So for example, there is a famous experiment that I talk about in the book where they took statistics students, and the statistics students were taught statistical principles that would be useful in actually analyzing athletics or sports. And then they went, and some of the students got called at the beginning of the semester before they'd covered the material. Some were called at the end of the semester afterwards. And the key thing about the survey was they never mentioned it had anything to do with the stats class. They just said, hey, I want to ask you some questions about sports. They're only being asked because they were in the class, but the interviewers did not talk to them about that. They didn't connect it. And basically what they found is that with some rare exceptions, the students did not use the statistics that they learned in the class to analyze the problems in sports. Things like why are batting averages much higher at the beginning of the season than at the end. So that was something where basically the propensity to use that was not improved by taking the class. So even if they had improved in the course of the class, they were not improving outside of the classroom when they were not being cued to use it. And of course, the other issue is retention. If you come back to those students that learned a lot 5 years later, are they still better?
No, it's not so much about whether they learned a lot. What it's more about for me,
Learn the mental attitudes.
the attitude. Well, also, I'm also the first one to admit that one class is never going to be enough, right? I mean, this is the same way that if you just work out for a couple of weeks, you're not going to maintain. So habit building takes a very long time to do. So the question is, if there is a group of people that is critically thinking at the end of the journey, is your statement that they would have been those critical thinkers no matter what, even if they hadn't gone through the habit building experience of the educational system? Or is your statement that the education may just be effective for a small group of people, but not for the majority of people? Because there's still a difference between those two things.
Yeah, you're right. So there definitely are some people that know how to think and know how to learn and have improved, and we may all even number ourselves among them. Since it's so hard to detect them in the empirical literature, I think you've got to say they're rare. And again, so rare that when you're trying to understand why education increases earnings, you can't really appeal to those people, because it's not like it's just one person in 100 or 50 that gets a financial gain or a career gain out of education. It's actually the normal thing that happens. Admittedly, with probably like maybe 25, 30% of people, it's hard to see that they got anything out of it financially or career-wise. But still, the median person definitely seems like they're getting a substantial boost from the school, and yet they don't seem like they've got much of a change in their critical thinking. There's another experiment that I talk about there where they actually just looked at people at the beginning and the end of both, I think, high school, beginning and end of undergraduate, beginning and end of grad school. And the main thing you see there is that at every level of education, people had improved in their critical thinking, but there was very little improvement within the program. So it very much looked like selection, where basically the people in high school who go to college are better. People in college who go to grad school are better, but it doesn't seem like they're improving much during the programs themselves. What I'll just say is I'm trying to understand how the current system works, how the educational system that we have works. Basically, there's two things that we know. One is that education totally helps your career and raises income. And the other one is it doesn't seem to really teach you very much.
Well, Bryan, I think you've raised some really challenging points for any educator. Thank you for coming on the show.
It is totally my pleasure. And I'll just say, you guys sound like you're well above the bar, so keep up the good work.
Thank you, Bryan. It was great to have you.
Thanks for listening to the All Else Equal podcast. Please leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. We love to hear from our listeners. Also, be sure to catch our next episode by subscribing or following our show wherever you listen to your podcasts. For more information and episodes, visit allelseequalpodcast.com or follow us on LinkedIn. The All Else Equal podcast is a joint production of Stanford University's Graduate School of Business and the Lauder Institute at the University of Pennsylvania. It is produced by University FM.